In the summer of 1849, when the Kansas plains were cracked from heat and the wheat curled at its edges like dry parchment, the stranger arrived in Whitfield Township on a pale gray mare. His boots were too clean for a man traveling so far, and his dark coat looked stitched with a kind of precision one didn't expect this deep into the frontier. His name, as he introduced himself with a slow, careful drawl, was Elias Whitmore. He claimed he was from Pennsylvania, but no one could quite place his accent. He didn't say much else, except that he was in need of a place to settle, and that he was a man of God and good manners. The townsfolk were suspicious of any stranger, but as the week wore on, something strange happened. The skies broke. Rain fell. Steady, thick, cool. The kind that came too rarely that year. It was as if the arrival of Mr. Whitmore had pleased the heavens, or disturbed them. By the second week, Elias had purchased a plot of land at the edge of town, land that had belonged to a family who had packed up and vanished during the last drought. No one asked too many questions. Most were just glad someone was finally putting a roof back on that forsaken house, though it was said the chimney was still stained black from whatever had burned there 10 years before. Elias worked fast, hired no help, and brought no wagon of supplies. And yet, the home was rebuilt within 2 months. Stronger, taller, with a new cross carved above the doorframe, though no one ever saw him attend the chapel on Sundays. It was around that time the women began to take notice. Elias, after all, was tall, courteous, and articulate. He read poetry aloud in the tavern. He smelled of sandalwood and something faintly metallic. When he walked into the general store, even the widows stood a little straighter. The first to fall under his spell was Margaret Tilson, the daughter of the blacksmith. They courted quietly. She was often seen walking the path toward his new home in the evenings, her hair braided with pale ribbons, her cheeks flushed. They were wed by the end of the 3rd month. Then came the silence. Margaret was no longer seen in town. At first, it was assumed she was simply adapting to her new domestic duties. Elias claimed she was feeling poorly, but well cared for. People accepted this. A newlywed bride, perhaps with child. Still, questions stirred. Then Elias appeared again one Sunday, strolling alone through the market. He seemed unbothered, polite, and charming as ever. When asked about Margaret, he said she had taken ill and gone to stay with his cousin's family near Missouri for treatment. No one verified the story. They couldn't. 3 months later, Elias proposed again, this time to Clara Neves, the baker's niece. It raised brows, but Clara accepted quickly. She moved into the house beyond the edge of town, and for a short while, laughter could be heard from the windows. She hung curtains, grew herbs, told friends she had never known such peace. Then, as with Margaret, she vanished from sight. Elias again offered explanations. He spoke of a letter from Clara's aunt requesting her presence in Arkansas, and that she had left in haste with his blessing. Clara's family never received such a letter. But they didn't press. Not openly. Elias remained calm, respectful, even generous. He donated to the chapel's roof repairs. He offered free sermons in his parlor, sermons that grew in attendance and curiosity. He spoke of devotion, of loyalty, of purifying love. His words dripped like honey but left a strange aftertaste, like iron and ash. And then came the third bride, Elise Verne, a schoolteacher from Illinois passing through to Colorado. She stayed in Whitfield longer than expected, claimed the land and air calmed her nerves. She rented a room near the chapel, but soon began taking long walks toward Elias's home. People whispered. She was too refined, too educated. But Elias courted her with gifts of rare books and songs played on a peculiar instrument no one had seen before. Part harp, part violin, entirely his own creation. Elise, too, married him. And after her wedding, she, too, vanished from view. By the following winter, Mr. Whitmore's house stood dark and silent for days at a time. No chimney smoke, no footsteps. But when questioned, Elias would appear suddenly, smiling, calm, always with a reason. Elise was visiting her sister. Margaret had sent word from Missouri. Clara was with family in Little Rock. He spoke with conviction. But no letters ever arrived. No witnesses. No carriages seen coming or going. The town grew restless. Then, one night, a storm like none had seen before rolled across the plains. Lightning struck twice upon the same tree outside Elias's home. The trunk split like an open wound. The next morning, young Caleb Wern, a boy no more than 12, swore he saw a pale woman at the upstairs window of Whitmore's house, pounding silently against the glass. Her mouth moved, but no sound escaped. When asked what she looked like, he said, "Like someone who forgot how to die." The story of the pale woman at the window traveled fast through Whitfield Township, carried on the breath of gossip and the unease of long-held suspicions. Caleb Warren's mother tried to quiet her son's tale, fearing ridicule from townsfolk and retribution from the enigmatic Mr. Whitmore, but the damage had already been done. Whispers turned into warnings, and even the most devout parishioners began skipping Mr. Whitmore's parlor sermons. The widow Agnes Harrow, an old woman whose eyesight had dimmed but whose mind remained sharp, was the first to speak openly. She sat in a rocking chair on the chapel steps one dusk, stroking a calico cat and watching the sun sink behind Whitmore's home. "I seen that house before it burned the first time," she muttered to anyone who would listen. "Same house, same eyes looking out, and they don't blink." People thought her senile, but her voice planted a seed in the minds of the townsfolk. The next week, an unseasonal frost swept through the town, killing crops and splitting water barrels overnight. Livestock grew sick, and the wind carried a strange sulfur scent. A few blamed nature, others blamed God, but some began to blame Whitmore. The sheriff, Jonah Klein, a large man with a lazy right eye and a family to protect, finally rode out toward the house on the edge of town. He claimed it was to check on the womenfolk, though in truth, the rumors gnawed at him. He had once danced with Margaret Tilson at the harvest fair, and her disappearance pricked at some buried part of his conscience. As he approached the property, he noticed the air grew heavier, as if the land itself had stopped breathing. The grass was brittle. The trees leaned away from the house. A single crow sat motionless on the fence post, staring. Whitmore opened the door before the sheriff had a chance to knock. He was smiling, but his eyes were shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Klein," he said smoothly, "what a surprise. Please do come in. The tea is warm." Klein hesitated but stepped inside. The air was thick with incense, sandalwood again, mixed with something acrid. The house was too quiet. No distant hum of cooking, no footsteps above. "Just checking in," Klein muttered. "Folks haven't seen your wife around." "Any of them?" Whitmore chuckled, an odd sound, like someone imitating human laughter. "Ah, the loneliness of a traveling household," he said. "Margaret, Clara, and Elise are all visiting their respective families. Letters come, but I imagine the post is slow these days." He offered no written proof. Klein scanned the room. The furniture was immaculate, ornate, but wrong somehow. The corners of the tables were too sharp. The wallpaper seemed to shift in the candlelight. And then he saw it, a portrait above the hearth, not a painting, but something more precise. A photograph, possibly or a daguerreotype, showing all three wives standing side by side. But their eyes were blank. Not in the way of early photography, but in the way of something absent. Something missing. Whitmore noticed Klein staring. "Beautiful, aren't they?" he said softly. "My angels." Klein cleared his throat and muttered something about getting back to town. As he turned, he caught a glimpse of movement from the stairwell. A figure. Flash of white. He paused, but Whitmore closed the door behind him. "Do come by again, Sheriff. We all get lonely out here." That night, Jonah Klein sat on his porch, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the edge of the prairie. He told no one what he saw, but he stopped going to church, stopped eating, and within 2 weeks, he was dead, collapsed on the chapel steps with his eyes wide open and his mouth filled with salt. The town doctor called it a seizure. Agnes Harrow called it a warning. "He looked too deep," she hissed. "The house don't like that." Rumors spiraled. The preacher held a service about false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing. A few families packed their belongings and left for Topeka. Still, Whitmore remained. His garden grew tall despite the frost. His home glowed each night, a pale greenish light flickering behind drawn curtains. Then one morning, the townsfolk awoke to a noise, high-pitched, rhythmic, and unnatural. It came from the well near the edge of the chapel yard. When they gathered to investigate, they found a doll. Porcelain, cracked and wet. Tied around its neck was a lock of red hair, unmistakably like Margaret Tilson's. That night, the baker's wife heard tapping at her window and swore she saw Clara's face reflected in the glass, though the yard was empty. Something was happening. Something old. The widow Harrow finally took it upon herself to act. She gathered 4 others, old-timers, skeptics, those who remembered the original fire and the cursed soil beneath that land. Armed with lanterns, they approached the house under cover of night. The gate opened on its own. The wind howled, though no trees swayed. As they crossed the threshold, they found the door ajar and the interior dark but warm. Inside, the house pulsed. Not metaphorically, the walls shifted like lungs, the floorboards creaked in rhythm, and the furniture had grown sinew. Agnes led them to the parlor. It was empty but for 3 chairs, each holding a woman's dress folded perfectly, with shoes placed below and rings set atop. No bodies. No blood. Just absence. A low voice echoed from the stairwell. "You should not have come." They turned and saw him, Elias Whitmore, but not quite. His skin shimmered faintly. His fingers were too long. His mouth stretched wrong. "I was promised wives," he said. "The soil demanded flesh. They chose me to plant the seed of eternity." He stepped forward, and the light from their lanterns sputtered and died. Agnes Harrow screamed. One of the men raised a crucifix. Whitmore only laughed. It was not human laughter. Only Agnes would escape that night, found the next morning by a passing cabman, clutching her cat and muttering about dresses that bled when touched. She never spoke again. The house stood empty for weeks. Then one day, a new man arrived in town. Clean boots, sharp coat. He said his name was Ellis Whitaker, and he was from Virginia. He asked if there were any homes for sale on the edge of town. And when he smiled, some swore they had seen that smile before, in a different mouth on a different name, in a house that still breathed beneath the Kansas dirt. Weeks passed, and Whitfield Township tried to move on, though something in the rhythm of the town had shifted. People walked faster, spoke softer, and left their lanterns burning longer into the night. The chapel stayed half empty on Sundays. The bakery stopped making wedding cakes. The children no longer played near the prairie's edge, and more than one farmer claimed their livestock refused to graze within view of the Whitmore house, which now stood abandoned but strangely intact. Some said they saw candles flickering behind its curtained windows at dusk, though no one dared get close enough to confirm. The sheriff's office, now overseen by the young and nervous Deputy Robert Finch, quietly marked the property as under dispute and advised travelers to steer clear. But the quiet did not last. Not once the McAnders family moved in. The McAnders were newly arrived from Ohio, a young couple, Helen and Thomas, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lottie. They had come west chasing opportunity and heard Whitfield was welcoming new settlers. No one had the heart to tell them what had happened. The land office, eager to reestablish order, sold them the Whitmore property for a pittance. "Just needs a little fixing up," they were told. The house, oddly, seemed almost pristine. The roof didn't leak. The floors didn't creak. And the smell of incense lingered faintly, like a guest that had overstayed their welcome but remained polite. Helen thought it quaint. Thomas, ever practical, was glad to have saved money. Lottie was simply thrilled to have a staircase to run up and down. But the town grew anxious again. Eyes watched from curtains. Nobody visited. On the 3rd day, Helen found a loose floorboard beneath the parlor rug. She pried it open and discovered a journal, old, leather-bound, its pages warped by time but legible. It was not Elias Whitmore's journal. The entries were dated 21 years earlier and belonged to a man named Reverend Wallace Hiram, a preacher who had once lived on the same land. His writings began hopeful, full of scripture, optimism, and gratitude for his new congregation. But as the pages wore on, the tone darkened. He described his wife's slow withdrawal from daily life, her sudden illness, the birth of a stillborn child, and then, most chillingly, the nightly whispers from beneath the cellar door, voices that called him by name, promising resurrection in exchange for devotion. "They are not demons," he wrote. "They are older than that, hungrier." Helen read deep into the night, horrified but unable to stop. The last entry read only, "I bury them all. But the house remembers. It always does." She said nothing to Thomas. But that night, she dreamed of a woman in a wedding dress walking slowly down the hallway, her veil soaked with rain. The next morning, Lottie complained that her closet door wouldn't stay shut. Thomas, assuming the house had warped with age, hammered it tight. That night, it opened anyway. Helen, now frightened, returned to the floorboard and checked for anything else, and found beneath the journal a small wooden box. Inside were 3 wedding rings, still warm to the touch. By the end of the week, strange things began to happen. The walls of the house seemed to breathe when no one was watching. Helen swore she heard humming from the kitchen. She was alone. Lottie began referring to her imaginary friend as Miss Margaret, who wore ribbons in her hair and liked to brush Lottie's doll's hair when everyone else was asleep. Thomas, growing frustrated with the unease in his home, declared it superstition and began renovations. He tore down a cross above the doorframe and tossed it into the fire. That night, the wind changed direction, and their chimney belched black smoke even though the fire had gone out. Helen finally told Thomas about the journal. They argued. He told her to burn it. She refused. The next day, Thomas didn't come back from the field. Helen found him at dusk, sitting in the dirt near the edge of the property, eyes vacant and lips moving soundlessly. When she touched him, he flinched violently and whispered, "They told me where he came from." He wasn't the first. He was only the willing. He said nothing more that night, just stared out toward the prairie, toward a spot where the wind never touched the grass. Helen went to the chapel the next morning, clutching the journal, demanding answers. The new preacher, a young man named Elijah Burke, skimmed the pages in silence and then offered a confession. He had once heard of Reverend Hiram in seminary, how he and his family had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and how their homestead had burned down under divine circumstances. The land was sold in secret. The records scrubbed. Some things, the preacher said, aren't meant to be reawakened, but it was too late. That night, Lottie disappeared. Helen had tucked her in, kissed her good night, and when she checked in the morning, the bed was empty. The closet door stood wide open. A single braid of pale ribbon was left on the pillow. Panic gripped the town. Search parties were formed. The prairie was scoured. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Just silence. Then, after 3 days, Lottie returned, walking barefoot down the main street at dawn, eyes closed, dress wet with dew. She was unharmed, but she no longer spoke. Her hair had been braided differently, in a way Helen had never done. When asked where she had been, she whispered, "She showed me the route. It's underneath everything." Helen, now desperate, returned to the house and began tearing it apart. She ripped up floorboards, tore down wallpaper, smashed furniture. Beneath the basement, she found something. Not a room, not a cellar, but a cavity. A wound in the earth itself, filled with bones that pulsed faintly in the candlelight. She dropped the journal into the hole. The air screamed. The door slammed shut behind her. Outside, the house exhaled a long, deep breath that smelled of burnt lavender and blood. That night, the lights returned to the windows. Faint, flickering, pale green. The town stayed quiet. No one approached. No one ever did again. Until the next family arrived. The year was now 1851, and Whitfield Township sat like a bruise beneath an endless sky. Seasons came and went with barely a whisper. Crops sprouted and died in short, confused cycles. Birds migrated in strange directions. The people remained, though fewer than before. Some left without selling their land, abandoning homes mid-meal or mid-prayer. Others simply disappeared, their beds still warm. And still, the house at the edge of the prairie stood undisturbed, tall and watchful, like a monument to forgetting. Few spoke of it now, not out of reverence or fear, but because something in the memory of the place had grown slick, like trying to grip a whetstone. People knew something was wrong, but couldn't articulate it. The mind recoiled from details. Names blurred. Time folded. Until one cold March morning, when Clara Neves walked into town. She wore the same pale blue dress she had last been seen in, a soft cotton thing with embroidered cuffs, and her boots were still laced with the same dusty ribbons. But her face had changed. Not in age, but in texture, as if her features had been remembered rather than preserved. Her eyes were glassy and wide, her skin flawless but drained of color. She walked with careful steps, like she was unsure of gravity. No one recognized her at first. Then someone said her name, a whisper more than a call, and she turned and smiled, though her teeth didn't quite meet. "Hello," she said in a voice too smooth. "I've come to find my husband." The townsfolk stood frozen. It had been more than a year since anyone had spoken of Elias Whitmore, more than a year since the McCanders vanished. Clara's return shattered the unspoken truce the town had made with silence. She walked to the general store and purchased sewing needles. She walked to the chapel and sat in the second pew. She spoke little, ate less, slept somewhere unknown. But every evening at the stroke of 7, she walked toward the edge of town and stared at the house. She never went inside, never crossed the gate, just stood still, lips moving as if in conversation, her breath visible even on warm nights. Children watched from windows. One boy claimed he saw another figure standing behind her, tall, with shoulders like smoke and eyes that gleamed like silver coins. The preacher sent a letter to the diocese, requesting reassignment. The blacksmith buried his tools and moved to Nebraska. And still Clara came, every night, whispering to the house. One afternoon, the widow Agnes Harrow, still alive, still muttering, approached her on the road. "You don't belong here," she said, clutching a rosary made of bones. "You died, girl. You bled and you died, and he took your voice to build his sermons." Clara looked at her with something like pity. "He said I would be whole again," she replied. "He said the roots just needed watering." Later that week, a traveling photographer passed through town. His name was Arthur Bell, and he made his living capturing images of frontier folk and trading prints for room and board. The townspeople warned him of the house of Clara, but curiosity often walks ahead of wisdom. He spotted Clara by the old well near the chapel and asked to photograph her. She agreed with a quiet nod. He set up his box camera and posed her beside the stones, asking her not to move. The shutter clicked. The image developed slowly in his portable bath. What appeared on the plate made him recoil. Clara was there, yes, but so were others. 3 blurred women stood behind her, each with hollow mouths open in a silent scream, their faces warped, stitched together from memory and malice. And standing over them all was a figure too tall, too thin, wearing a coat made of shadows and a crown of ash. Bell left town that night. He abandoned his equipment in the chapel, where the preacher found the photograph days later, and burned it without looking again. Then the deaths began again. First, the banker's wife, who was found in the garden with her hands folded over a bouquet of dried lavender, her tongue blackened and eyes missing. Then a trapper was found in the woods, his ribs peeled open like pages of a book. The town buried them quietly. No sermons, no hymns, just dirt. And every night, Clara stood at the edge of the house, whispering. One evening, a young girl named Marnie followed her, curious and too brave for her own good. She crept behind a cluster of trees and listened. What she heard, she would later repeat to her mother in a voice too flat. "He needs one more bride. Just one more. Then the soil will open and let them out." Clara vanished again the next day. No one saw her leave. No wagon. No footprints. Just an empty dress on the chapel pew, neatly folded with 3 sewing needles resting atop. That night, the house lit up again, every window glowing faintly green. The wind carried a smell of burnt paper and crushed flowers. And deep beneath the floorboards, something shifted, something old and patient. The townsfolk gathered at the church and held a vote. No names were written. No arguments were made, but the outcome was unanimous. At sunrise, they would burn the house. Every man who could wield a torch and every woman who could carry salt stood at the edge of the prairie and stared at the cursed place. The wind pushed against them, thick and hot. They moved together. The gate opened on its own. As they approached the porch, the door creaked open, revealing a hallway lined with portraits. None of them dared step inside. They tossed oil and cloth and flame through broken windows. The fire caught quickly, too quickly, and the house screamed. Not crackled, not collapsed, but screamed, a shrill human cry that shattered 3 panes in the chapel and left the horses bucking in their stalls. The flames turned blue, then white, then vanished. Not burned out, vanished. The house stood as it had before, untouched, pristine, as if nothing had happened. And standing at the doorway was Clara Neves. She smiled, and this time her teeth met perfectly. After the failed attempt to burn the Whitmore house, something broke inside the people of Whitfield Township. The fear that once cowered in dark corners now spread like rot through the daylight. Doors were locked with iron nails. Mirrors were turned to face the walls. Children were forbidden from speaking the names of those who had vanished, and even the preacher stopped preaching. He simply sat in the chapel pews each morning, staring at the altar as though it no longer held meaning. But the house remained. Still tall. Still watching. Still waiting. Clara Neves, if it truly was her, was seen each morning sweeping the front porch, arranging dried herbs along the railing, and humming a lullaby none of the townsfolk recognized. The notes lingered, drifting into homes through keyholes and under doors, and those who heard it often awoke the next day with nosebleeds and the taste of rust in their mouths. News of the events eventually reached neighboring settlements. Most dismissed it as frontier hysteria. Droughts and death could fray the mind, after all. But one man took the stories seriously. His name was Josiah Thorne, a former mortician from St. Louis turned spiritualist after his own wife died and returned to him in dreams that smelled of smoke. He arrived in Whitfield under the guise of a wandering apothecary, pulling a mule-drawn cart filled with tinctures, powders, and books with no titles on their spines. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that never left his head, and a coat stitched with symbols too old to trace. He asked few questions, but listened intently. The townsfolk, desperate for any solution, pointed him toward the house without saying its name. Josiah nodded. "I've seen houses like this," he murmured. "They don't live. They grow." That night, he camped beside the chapel and scattered ash in a perfect circle around himself. He lit black candles and muttered in a tongue no one understood. By morning, his eyes were rimmed with red, and his hands shook as he packed his belongings. He told the preacher, "There is no spirit here. No ghost. It's something older. Something that remembers being buried and wants to grow again. The house is only its mouth." Josiah asked to be left alone for one night inside the house. Just one. He claimed he would speak to whatever lived beneath it, barter with it if he could, bind it if he must. The town agreed, but no one offered to walk in there. He went alone, dragging a sack filled with bones, salt, and charcoal. He entered the house at sunset. No lantern lit, no sound but the closing of the door behind him. The townspeople waited in silence, staring at the horizon through the night. Around midnight, a howl rose from the fields, low and bone-deep, like the sound of a canyon breaking. Then, silence again. When morning came, the door stood open. Josiah was gone. In his place, just inside the threshold, sat a pile of ash shaped like a seated man. His hat lay atop it, untouched. Around the ash were symbols burned into the floor, symbols none of the townsfolk could recognize, but all of them swore their eyes ached trying to look at them for too long. One woman, May Collins, stepped close enough to touch the ash. She knelt and whispered a prayer. As her fingers brushed the hat, the pile collapsed inward, sending a gray plume into the air. She began to scream, not out of pain, but in recognition. She claimed she heard Josiah's voice in her head, repeating 3 words over and over. "It remembers hunger." May never spoke again after that. Not a single word. She wandered town barefoot, drawing spirals on every surface she passed. Barn walls, fences, even children's cheeks if they got too close. The preacher called a meeting. For the first time in weeks, the chapel was full. Tired eyes, quiet voices. He told them they had to leave Whitfield. All of them. The town was lost. The land soured. "It doesn't matter what you believe," he said. "Whatever that thing is, it isn't bound by faith, and it isn't repelled by holy words. It eats silence. It drinks memory. It wears people like clothing. And I think it's growing stronger." Some agreed. Some didn't. The next morning, 6 families packed wagons and rode out. The rest stayed, held in place by denial, poverty, or fear. That same night, a knock came at the door of the old schoolhouse. The teacher, Miss Eliza Brenner, opened it to find a young girl standing in the moonlight. She was barefoot, her hair in long wet braids, and her skin the pale color of mushroom flesh. She looked up with empty eyes and asked, "Is school still open?" Eliza recognized the child. She had taught her 2 years ago, Charlotte Riggins, before the Riggins family vanished during the frost season. She let the girl in. By morning, every slate in the schoolhouse had been filled with words. Not written in chalk, but scratched in with fingernails. The same phrase over and over, carved so deep the boards splintered. "The root has a heart." Eliza was nowhere to be found. Only her spectacles remained, placed neatly on her desk. The townsfolk stopped counting the dead. They stopped trying to leave. Those who did manage to escape were found days later in nearby towns, speaking nonsense or gouging out their own eyes. And every night, the house on the edge of the prairie pulsed faintly. Sometimes, in the quiet between midnight and dawn, a song would drift across the fields, a lullaby sung in a voice too wide, too hollow, like a cave echoing back a memory. Some swore they saw figures dancing in the windows, dressed in wedding gowns that glowed faintly, their feet never touching the floor. One man, in a fever dream, claimed to see the truth beneath the soil. He spoke of a tree with no leaves and veins instead of roots, of bones curled like tendrils, reaching for the sky, of a seed that had fallen from stars long forgotten. He said the house wasn't a house, but a flower blooming in time with the town's fear. Then he died, mouth open, eyes dry, fingers pointed toward the house. Spring arrived with no birdsong. The wind carried no scent of blooming grass or tilled soil. The air in Whitfield Township had grown heavy with stillness, the kind that sits in a room before someone says something unforgivable. The townspeople no longer spoke of the house at the edge of the prairie. It had become a shape in their minds that carefully stepped around, like a well with no bottom. The chapel bell had not rung in weeks, rust gathering along its rim like dried blood. Dust clung to pews that once overflowed. And though the preacher no longer held sermons, he still came each day, sitting beneath the bell tower as if waiting for a sign that never came. That is, until the earth beneath the bell cracked open. It was near midnight when the sound came, a low grinding moan like stone dragging against stone. Those still awake heard it in their floorboards, their walls, their teeth. It made windows tremble and hearth fires dim. The preacher ran from the chapel, barefoot and breathless, following the sound to the bell tower's base, where the stone floor had split. A jagged fissure opened where there had once been smooth flagstone, and from it rose a scent that turned his stomach. Wet copper, rotting wood, and something older. Not the smell of death, but the memory of it. He knelt beside the crack and saw something move below. Not fast, not threatening, just steady, alive. It pulsed, as if breathing, and in its motion he swore he saw veins, thick, dark roots pushing slowly upward. By morning, the crack had spread to the chapel's foundation, and more appeared along the roads and gardens under beds. The land itself was unraveling, or perhaps remembering. The widow Agnes Harrow, now too frail to leave her porch, whispered to a passing child that the town had been built on something stolen. The old ones were buried here, she said, long before we plowed this dirt, long before Elias Whitmore gave it a name. When asked who the old ones were, she only pointed toward the house and said, "Not dead, just waiting." A group of townsmen, what was left of the able and willing, gathered at the chapel that evening to make a decision. Among them were Caleb Wern, now 17 and gaunt with sleeplessness, May Collins, still mute but capable of carving meaning into wood with swift precision, and Isaac Bell, brother of the photographer who had vanished. They formed a plan, not to destroy the house again, but to go beneath it, to find the root, the heart, whatever Josiah Thorne had hinted at in his last words. They believed something physical lay beneath the foundation, something that could be cut, burned, exorcised. It was a desperate hope, but desperation had replaced faith long ago. Under cover of night, they approached the house. It welcomed them. The front door, always closed before, now stood ajar. The interior smelled of damp stone and wilted lilies. The parlor was empty. No Clara. No music. No trace of the three wives. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the house had grown a second skin beneath the wallpaper. They found the entrance to the basement hidden behind a false bookcase, an opening lined with symbols carved in bone. The air grew colder with each step downward. At the base of the stairs, they found that earth had opened, literally, revealing a tunnel of compacted soil and root, slick with moisture and lined with faintly glowing fungus. The passage sloped downward unnaturally, in spirals rather than angles. The deeper they walked, the more they felt time stretch and bend. Isaac's watch ticked slower. Caleb's lantern burned blue. May scratched tally marks into the wall with a nail she'd hidden in her sleeve, but each time she looked back, they had rearranged themselves into patterns. They passed bones, human, they assumed, but shaped wrong. Femurs too long. Skulls with too many teeth. Then, after what felt like days but could have been minutes, they found a root. It was not a tree root, though it mimicked the shape. It rose from the floor in thick, braided cords of muscle, bone, and something like wood. It pulsed in silence, every beat sending vibrations through the soil. Embedded in it were faces. Not corpses, faces. Wide-eyed and whispering without sound. Margaret Tilson, Clara Neves, Elise Verne, others too, faded but recognizable. Each woman's likeness emerged from the root like a fossil preserved mid-scream. Above them all, suspended in the chamber's center, with a shape humanoid, but stretched, its limbs too long, its ribs exposed like scaffolding. It had no eyes, only a smooth mask of skin. But it watched them. They felt it. Caleb raised his blade, an iron cleaver blessed by 3 preachers who had since gone mad. He stepped forward, gritting his teeth. But the moment he touched the root, the air screamed. The faces began to writhe. Elise Vern's mouth opened and expelled a gust of air that extinguished their lanterns. May dropped to her knees, gouging the soil with her hands. Isaac fell backward and cracked his head on stone. And then the shape spoke, not with words, but with memory. It showed them the first burial, the priestess of something older than scripture, buried alive to seed the land. It showed Elias Whitmore being chosen, drawn by blood and ritual to this forgotten altar. It showed the wives not as victims, but as offerings. Willing or not, it did not matter. They had been used, and now the offering was complete. Caleb screamed and brought the blade down again and again. Sparks flew. Black ichor spilled from the root, and a howl echoed up the tunnel like a storm caught in a throat. May began to hum. Isaac wept. The earth shook. Something split far above them. Then the world turned white. When they awoke, they were lying in the prairie grass, covered in dirt and frost. The house was gone. Not destroyed. Gone. No debris. No foundation. Just grass. The sun shone pale and soft. Birds sang cautiously. Whitfield breathed again. Of the 3, only Caleb returned to town. May wandered west without a word. Isaac sat in the chapel for 2 days, then hanged himself in the belfry. The preacher delivered no eulogy, just lit a candle and whispered, "Let the earth forget." But the ground still cracked when it rained. And some nights, if you stood very still near the prairie's edge, you could feel the heartbeat. It began with a letter, folded precisely and sealed with wax so dark it appeared black. No return address, no postage mark, just the name, "To whom it may concern at Whitfield." It arrived in late autumn, when the leaves had browned and dropped without ever turning gold, and when the air seemed to carry voices just at the edge of hearing. The postmaster, an old man named Simon Griggs, who had survived 3 disappearances, 2 fires, and 1 strange night where all the town's mirrors cracked at once, found the letter placed carefully on his sorting table. It hadn't come by train. It hadn't come by rider. He had locked the building himself the night before, and yet there it sat as if it had always been there. He didn't open it, didn't touch it, just walked to the chapel and left it on the preacher's empty pulpit. And then he resigned, packed a satchel, and boarded a train to nowhere. The town never saw him again. The preacher, Elijah Burke, now pale and drawn, with hands that trembled even in stillness, read the letter aloud to no one. The chapel was empty, but for the echo of pews that once held faithful hearts. The letter was written in elegant, slanted cursive on thick parchment that smelled faintly of mold and lavender. It read like a warning, a confession, and a riddle all in one. To the people of Whitfield, should any remain, I write to you not as a savior, but as a witness. I have seen the house before it ever stood. I have dreamed its windows. I have walked its halls in fever and found myself returned to bed with soil beneath my nails. You are not cursed. You are remembered. The land was never yours. The blood it drank was never enough, only borrowed. You have unearthed its tongue. You have fed its memory. Now it dreams of you. And when it wakes, it will speak in root and ruin. The preacher folded the letter slowly, hands shaking worse than ever, and stared at the floor for hours. He left the letter on the altar and locked the chapel door from the outside. He never entered it again. Over the following days, more letters arrived, slipped under doors, folded into fence posts, found inside cook pots and wells, and inside the sleeves of coats hung up at night, all written in the same hand. None addressed, all warnings. One read, "The seed remembers the hand that planted it." Another, "She was never his wife. She was his key." And another, "The heart of the house beats in a place with no sky." The people grew frantic. Those who had tried to forget were now confronted by truths they didn't understand. The letters did not explain what the house had been. They only suggested it had always been, and that Elias Whitmore had been its herald, not its creator. something began to fester in the collective conscience of Whitfield. The sense that their sins, though unknowable, had already been counted. Dreams turned strange. One girl saw her mother braid her hair using worms instead of ribbon. A farmer woke with dirt in his lungs. A man who could not read was found muttering the phrases from the letters in a voice not his own. Then came the visitor. Not on horseback, not by cart. He simply appeared one morning, sitting on the edge of the dry well near the center of town, dressed in a gray coat with no seams and wearing a wide, flat hat that cast no shadow. He was clean, ageless, with pale yellow eyes that did not blink. He spoke rarely and always in whispers, but his voice carried as if spoken into each ear directly. When asked his name, he replied, "I am the footnote in your inheritance." When asked why he had come, he said only, "To hear the roots speak." People avoided him, but no one dared chase him off. Within days, more cracks appeared, beneath the schoolhouse, beneath the old mercantile, beneath the homes that had survived fire and flood and time. From each crack came the sound of whispering, not loud, not constant, but steady enough that silence had to be redefined. The town blacksmith, one of the few who still kept a semblance of strength and sanity, tried to seal a crack with molten iron. That night, his forge exploded. They found his body fused into the anvil, smiling. May Collins returned. She had been gone for months, presumed dead or vanished into the nothing beyond the prairie. She walked into town barefoot, hair cut short and eyes milky white. She carried nothing but a bundle of letters tied with thorny twine. She gave them to the preacher without a word. He read them and wept until he vomited blood. Then he stopped speaking entirely. The letters were written in multiple hands, Clara's, Elisa's, Margaret's, and one unfamiliar but eerily precise. They told stories not of horror, but of longing, of hunger disguised as love, of invitations masked as dreams, of being asked gently to stay forever in a place where time had folded. One letter ended with, "He loved us," but the house loved him more. The cracks deepened. Roots rose from them, not vines or wood, but slick, vein-filled tendrils that pulsated and curled like fingers stretching after sleep. They did not reach. They did not attack. They simply emerged, observing. The town gathered one last time in the square, huddled like cattle before storm. No one spoke of resistance. No one spoke of running. They only asked the visitor by the well what would happen next. He looked up slowly and whispered, "The house has remembered its name, and soon it will be called." That night, the wind stopped entirely. Not slow, it stopped. Lanterns flickered out. Dogs howled once, then were never heard again. And from the prairie came the sound of shifting stone, of doors opening where no walls stood, of voices layered over one another until they formed a chorus that said only one word, return. And in the distance, where there had been only grass and ruin, the house stood again, whole, silent, waiting. It stood where it had always stood, though not a single beam remained from what once had burned or vanished. The house at the edge of the prairie had returned, not rebuilt, not resurrected, but returned, as if it had only been hidden behind the folds of reality and now stepped back into view. It was taller than before, with an extra floor that hadn't existed in the minds of those who remembered it. The windows were no longer square, but arched, like cathedrals. The roof curved as if breathing, the shingles pulsing faintly with some inner glow. It wore the illusion of wood and stone, but no bird dared land on its eaves, and no wind disturbed its shutters. It simply stood, rooted not into the earth, but into something deeper, something beneath the memory of soil. The townsfolk gathered again, though this time not in defiance or unity. They stood at the edge of the prairie in scattered clusters, staring not with anger or grief, but with the quiet acknowledgement one offers a rising tide. They understood, without words, that the house was no longer something separate from them. It had fed too long, too well. It had shaped itself from their fears, memories, and offerings. It was not merely a place. It was an inheritance. The visitor by the well had not moved in days, but now he stood, his shadow stretching too far against the light. He raised a single hand and pointed. The wind returned, not from the west or east, but from below, cold and damp, curling around ankles like fingers testing for warmth. Inside the chapel, the bell rang. Once, just once, and it cracked straight through, splitting the bronze with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. The preacher, silent for weeks, fell to his knees at the altar and began to laugh, not with madness, but with the relief of final understanding. He whispered, "It was never a curse. It was a door." And then he died gently, like a candle pinched between fingers. Outside, the roots continued to rise from the ground, now stretching toward the house. They did not touch it, but surrounded it, weaving a nest or perhaps a crown around its base. Birds that no one had seen in decades returned, not flying but walking. Small, black things with no eyes and feathers that shimmered like mirrors. They gathered on rooftops and fence posts, silent witnesses to the becoming. Caleb Wern, now hardened by years of loss and strange survival, stepped forward. He carried no weapon, only a bundle of rags tied around a shard of mirror he had kept hidden since the day he and May descended beneath the foundation. He had seen what lay beneath the house. He had cut into the root. He knew it had never died, only slept. Now he moved toward it, each step deliberate, the grass bending away from his feet. The townsfolk watched but did not stop him. May returned once again as if summoned, stood among them, whispering into her own cupped hands. The air thickened. As Caleb approached the house, the door opened without touch. Inside, the light pulsed with no visible source, and the walls shimmered like oil on water. He stepped inside. The door closed. From the outside, there was no sound, no movement. But those watching saw something else. The house grew taller, not physically, but in presence. It pressed against the sky. The color of the windows shifted with each breath. And above it all, a faint melody began to play, not from any instrument, but from within the bones of those who heard it. It was a lullaby none could name, but all remembered from dreams they couldn't recall. Inside the house, Caleb found himself in the parlor, though it no longer resembled the place where sermons had been whispered. The furniture was bone white, shaped from curved things that looked too much like spines. The hearth was lit with a fire that produced no heat, and standing before him was Elias Whitmore, not aged, not withered. The same as he had always been, immaculate coat, polite posture, eyes too kind. "You've come to see the seed," Elias said, as if welcoming an old friend. "You cut it once. It remembers you. You left your voice in its wound." Caleb stepped forward, mirror shard clenched tightly. "I didn't come to fight," he said. "I came to know." Elias smiled. "Then come below." He led Caleb through a hall that twisted with every step, growing narrower and wider in impossible rhythm. Doors lined the walls, some cracked open, revealing glimpses of places that looked like memories he hadn't lived. A girl brushing her hair in a mirror that reflected another face. A man digging a grave that filled itself. A wedding with no guests, only shadows in the pews. Caleb passed them all. He descended the stairs. The root chamber was no longer hidden, no longer underground. It pulsed in the open center of the house, rising through every floor like a column of living history. Around it were figures, not corpses, not people. Shapes that wore human likeness like clothing. Clara, Elise, Margaret, others, all frozen mid-motion, mid-thought. Faces lifted toward the root as if waiting for a breath. Elias stood beside them. They are not trapped. They are held, preserved in choice. Each one gave something. Each one became part of the telling. Caleb stepped forward and looked into the root. He saw his own reflection, not aged, not scarred, but still, waiting. "What does it want?" he asked. Elias placed a hand on the root. "To be remembered, to be rooted." All memory seeks permanence, and memory is strongest when planted in fear. Caleb raised the mirror shard and pressed it to his chest. Blood welled. He stepped toward the root and pressed his other hand into it. The room shook. The figures around them blinked for the first time. Elias stepped back, smiling. "You're giving it your truth," he whispered. "It will grow well with that." The root absorbed the blood. The mirror pulsed. And for one moment, Caleb saw everything. How the house had traveled. How it had worn different names in different places. How it always returned to land forgotten and repopulated by the hopeful and the lost. He saw its first shape, not as a house, but as a shadow cast by stars no longer in the sky. And then he saw himself, his childhood, his loss, his grief, all feeding the thing that wanted only to be seen. When Caleb stepped back outside, the townsfolk gasped. His eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with memory. He did not speak. He simply nodded. And behind him, the house breathed one long exhale and then fell silent. Not vanished, not gone, but resting. For now. Months passed, and though the house remained at the edge of the prairie, it no longer called. No lights flickered in its windows. No songs drifted from its rafters. It stood still, as if sleeping, its wooden skin pale and pulsing faintly only in moonlight. The townsfolk did not approach it. They resumed the routines they could salvage, planting, building, pretending. Yet the air in Whitfield had shifted permanently. Children who were born after the house reappeared were silent until the age of 3, and when they spoke, they often spoke of things they shouldn't know. Names of women buried without markers, details of events no longer recorded in any town archive, and songs and languages no one had ever taught them. Livestock born in the southern fields near the house refused to feed. Water drawn from nearby wells sometimes came up warm. A sense of being watched clung to every shadow. The people endured, but they knew the house was not finished. It was only remembering. Then came the archivist. He arrived on foot, clothed in layers of brown and blue wool, carrying a satchel that appeared too large for his narrow frame. His boots were scuffed but well-made, and he introduced himself simply as Mr. Fun, offering no first name, no hometown, no credentials. He claimed he was a cartographer and archivist of unofficial places, a phrase that meant little to anyone but struck an immediate chord in the preacher's successor, a young woman named Ruth Calder, who had taken up stewardship of the chapel after Elijah Burke's death. She, like others, had dreamed of the house, its rooms, its breathing, and when Mr. Fun spoke of mapping forgotten geography, she saw in him something that felt familiar, like an echo. He made no demands, asked no payment, and promised no solutions. He only asked to stay for a time and be given access to stories. Places like this, he said, exist between versions of the world. I only want to find their edges. Ruth led him into the chapel. The townsfolk, weary and curious, began to share what they remembered. Mr. Fun took notes in a long book bound in bark and rawhide, writing with a pen made of bone. He never asked the same question twice. He never corrected anyone's contradictions. He listened as if each version of events were equally true. After a week, he stopped asking questions and began to draw. The map began as a spiral, a strange choice for a cartographer, but quickly grew into something else. Buildings were placed not by their physical location but by emotional weight, as described by the people who lived through the house's return. The schoolhouse appeared not at the center of town, but on the southern edge of the map, connected by a path of jagged lines that resembled nerves. The chapel appeared inverted, its steeple buried into the ground. The house, however, was not drawn at all. Instead, at the edge of the parchment, where the spiral nearly ended, Mr. Fun left a blank space. The house, he explained when asked, is not in the town. It is beside the town. Like a question beside a statement, Ruth pressed him for more. What is it? What does it want? He closed his book gently. It wants to be remembered, but not in pieces. In whole, which means it must be told fully. Its shape is a story that repeats until someone tells it differently. She did not understand. Not yet. That night, Ruth dreamed of her mother. But her mother had died during childbirth, and Ruth had never seen her face. In the dream, her mother stood beside a version of the house Ruth had never seen, made of black stone, not wood, with windows that blinked instead of shined. Her mother said only, "It wore him once. It will wear again. You must teach it to forget." Ruth woke with blood on her palms and soil beneath her nails. She found Mr. Fun already awake, seated in the chapel with his map unfolded before him. Without turning, he said, "It spoke to you. That means it's listening." He revealed something then, something he hadn't shared with anyone else in Whitfield. This wasn't the first house, nor the second, nor even the 10th. They rise in places where memory has no place to rest, he said. Old trauma, old blood, old promises. They root themselves in stories no one finishes. The man you knew as Elias Whitmore, he was only a gardener. The seed is older than names. He rolled up the map and handed it to Ruth. It's growing again, but it hasn't chosen its new face. That gives you time. If you can confuse it, make it forget its own shape, it may fall asleep again. Not die, but dream. Ruth didn't know what that meant, not entirely. But she took the map, and that night she sat in the chapel with a candle and wrote a sermon not from scripture, but from memory. She wrote of things she never lived. Women in white dresses floating above fire, a man digging graves in silence, children born with teeth and whispering roots. She wrote them as if they were parables, stories with lessons. She wrote until dawn, and when she finished, she placed the paper on the altar and rang the broken chapel bell with her bare hands. It didn't sound, but the wind shifted. The next day, the house changed. A window vanished. A door appeared where none had been. One shingle cracked, and from the crack came a small sigh, as if the house had forgotten why it had stood. Mr. Finn left the next morning, leaving behind only a note. You've begun the retelling. Be careful what shape you give it. And though the house still stood, its angles were slightly off now. Its breath no longer matched the wind. Some nights it flickered, as if unsure of itself. And Ruth kept writing, because forgetting, she realized, might be the only way to survive remembering. Winter crept across Whitfield without announcement. No frostbitten winds or flurries of snow. Only a slow dimming of the sun, as if the sky itself forgot how to shine. The air remained dry and still, holding its breath. The house stood unchanged at the edge of the prairie, except it wasn't unchanged. To most, it looked the same: slanted roof, shuttered windows, door crooked slightly to the left. But to those who looked longer than they should, it no longer fit the space it occupied. The proportions were wrong. Corners bent inward. Shadows lingered longer than the sun allowed. Ruth Calder knew this. She had been watching it every day, notebook in hand, writing versions of the house that might undo it. Mr. Funn's words echoed in her. Be careful what shape you give it. So she wrote carefully, deliberately, trying to twist the house through narrative, pushing it toward forgetting. Some days it worked. The porch would appear slightly decayed. The chimney leaned. A shutter fell with a soft thud one morning, splintering into pieces that bled sap instead of dust. But other days, her stories failed, and the house returned to form. Worse, sometimes her words seemed absorbed, reflected back. Once, she wrote of a broken piano in the hallway, keys missing. The next night, a sound echoed across the town, a piano playing itself, one slow note at a time, all from inside the house. She tore those pages out and burned them behind the chapel. Still, the house remembered. Caleb Warren had not spoken since returning from within. He now lived in the attic of the old mercantile, eyes always on the horizon. People brought him food. He accepted it. But he never answered questions, not even Ruth's. One afternoon, she brought him bread and sat beside him. You went further than anyone, she whispered. You touched it hard. What did you give it? Caleb didn't move for a long time. Then, just as she stood to leave, he whispered, It wasn't my truth. It was my guilt. I gave it what I couldn't forgive. She asked him what that was. He looked at her with eyes that barely held light and said, My brother followed me into the basement. I never pulled him back out. The next morning, a grave opened in the old cemetery, one that hadn't been dug but rather unfolded from beneath. Inside was a child's coat and nothing else. No name, no body, just the faint imprint of a hand in the soil. Ruth wept over it, though she didn't know who the coat belonged to. She buried it again, this time with her own blanket wrapped around it. That night, the house dimmed for the first time in weeks. Its breath grew shallow. The townsfolk noticed. Hope flickered. But something else awoke. The visitor by the well, gone since the house's last reappearance, returned. He stood precisely where he always had, dressed the same, unmoving. He said nothing. But each day after his return, something new appeared in the town. A wooden box filled with stones carved like teeth. A flock of birds that fell dead midair, each with eyes replaced by mirrors. A mirror that showed not reflections, but what might have been different versions of the house, standing in cities it had never touched. Ruth looked into that mirror and saw herself standing in a cathedral of bone, preaching to pews filled with figures in wedding dresses. She smashed the mirror before it showed more. More letters arrived, but now they were written in Ruth's own hand, pages she had not written, or at least didn't remember writing. Sermons filled with names she didn't know. Instructions in languages she couldn't read. One note simply said, The root has reached the chapel floor. The bells are growing silent again. She checked the chapel and found fine threads of black mold crawling up the altar, pulsing faintly, as if hearing her thoughts. And still the children dreamed. They spoke of tunnels beneath the town, carved in spirals. A man with a paper face who told them stories they forgot upon waking. Of a woman who stood in their rooms with no feet, her veil dripping like wax. Parents tried prayers. They tried salt. They tried leaving. One family fled in the night, taking only what they could carry. They were found 5 miles out, standing in a field, clothes soaked through with mud, whispering, "We never left." The road circled back. Ruth realized something then. The house wasn't just remembering. It was building. Each dream, each story, each act of fear and mourning. It was constructing something beneath memory, an architecture of grief, and it needed a cornerstone. Someone to anchor the story, to complete the shape. That night, she wrote a new sermon. This one was not meant to erase the house, or confuse it, or distort its face. This one was meant to finish the story. She titled it, "The Bride Without a Name." In it, she told of a woman buried in secret long before the house stood. A woman promised to something ancient. Her grave forgotten, her name erased. But her spirit lingered, growing roots that twisted through the town's history. When Elias Whitmore arrived, he did not bring the house. He heard it calling, and he built it in her image. Each wife he took was an echo. Each sermon, a ritual. The house was never a curse. It was a memorial. But one left unfinished, and that was why it kept returning. She had never been given a name, never been mourned. At dawn, Ruth rang the cracked bell one final time. She carried the sermon to the edge of the prairie and stepped toward the house. This time, it did not breathe. It did not open. It simply watched. She placed the sermon at its threshold and whispered, "You are remembered." Then she turned and walked away. Behind her, the house shuddered. Its doors split down the center. And from within came a single voice. Not Elias, not Clara, not the root, but something softer. It said, "Thank you." And the house, for the first time, was silent. After the voice whispered, "Thank you," a quiet fell over Whitfield deeper than any silence the town had ever known. It wasn't simply the absence of sound. It was the absence of weight, of pressure, of the invisible breath the house had exhaled into every crack of wood, every drop of water, every unspoken thought for years. The air grew still, but not ominous. It was as if the land had exhaled, and for the first time in generations, did not inhale again. Ruth Calder returned to the chapel and sat at the altar where the mold had begun to creep, now dried into harmless dust. She placed her hand over the sermon's remaining page, the one she hadn't burned, and whispered the name she had written only once, carefully and without looking back, Morella. The name had come to her in a dream, uttered by the bride without a name, the woman buried before the house, before Whitfield, before memory. And when Ruth spoke it, something uncoiled inside the chapel. Not malevolence, closure. The root had been named, and naming is a kind of burial. The townsfolk waited in their homes. No one approached the house. No one needed to. Over the next 3 days, something strange happened. Color returned. The sky, once a dull gray or bloodless blue, began to warm. Birds, normal ones, with eyes that blinked and feathers that didn't shimmer like mirrors, returned to the fields. Flowers bloomed too early. Trees bore fruit with no season. The soil softened, as if the prairie had forgotten the years of drought and blood. People spoke again, in full sentences. Children laughed without crying in their sleep. And the well water no longer tasted like iron. Ruth spent her mornings writing not sermons but letters. Letters to no one, or perhaps everyone. She wrote to the house, to the women it remembered, to Elias Whitmore, to the names carved into stones in the overgrown cemetery. She left the letters beneath the chapel bell, one each day, folded into the shape of birds. After 7 days, the letters stopped blowing away. They vanished. On the 8th morning, the house was gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed, gone. The field where it had stood was soft, the grass undisturbed, no sign of foundation or root or ash. Not even a mark in the soil where its shadow had once stretched. Just wind and wildflowers and light. Ruth walked there and stood in the center of where the door had been. She closed her eyes, heard nothing, felt nothing, and wept with relief. But not everyone accepted it. Caleb Warren refused to believe the story was finished. He began to wander again, out beyond the prairie, drawing spirals in the dirt with the heel of his boot. He dug in empty places. sat beside old Wells. One evening, Ruth found him carving a symbol into the barn wall, one she had seen in the root chamber before she fled. "It's not gone," he told her. "It's just moved. It needs a new story." She tried to reason with him, but he only smiled a tight, sad smile. "We didn't kill it, Ruth. You taught it how to sleep. But stories don't die. They wait to be told again." That night, he vanished. His bed undisturbed, his boots still beside the door. The only clue was a torn scrap of Ruth's sermon, folded into the shape of a heart, found resting on his pillow. Weeks passed, then months. Whitfield changed slowly, like a wound healing in layers. New families arrived. Children were born. Homes repaired. The town hall reopened. Laughter returned to the market. The chapel bell was reforged. No one spoke of the house unless they were drunk or grieving or walking alone after dark. Some claimed they could still feel it, not here but elsewhere, like a memory pressing against the edge of perception. Some had dreams. Others never remembered them at all. But the land was calm, until the archivist returned. Mr. Finn walked into town without announcement, wearing the same coat, same satchel, same quiet smile. His face looked unchanged, but his eyes had darkened somehow. He asked to see Ruth, and she met him at the chapel, sitting on the newly painted steps. She handed him her journal, the one she'd used to track the house, the sermons, the retellings. He leafed through it in silence. When he finished, he nodded and reached into his bag. From it, he pulled a second map. Not of Whitfield, not entirely. It was larger, older, inked in lines that shifted slightly when viewed in direct light. The town was there, of course, marked with a spiral. But so were other spirals. Dozens of them. Across rivers and valleys and oceans. Towns she didn't know. Places she had never heard of. "It's always been more than one," he told her. "They bloom where stories die unfinished, where grief roots deep and no one dares to speak its name." He traced one spiral with his finger. "This one is opening now, in a city made of stone and glass. It's already begun remembering." Ruth asked what he would do. "I follow," he said. "I archive. I record the shape. And sometimes I find someone like you." He paused, looked at her with something like sorrow. "You ended one telling. That matters. It might even matter more than we know. But this story, it doesn't have a final page. Only pauses." He handed her a new book, empty, bound in the same strange leather. "Keep writing. If it calls again, you'll hear it." Then he left, and Ruth remained in Whitfield, where the wind once more carried only wind, and the roots stayed buried, and the children sang songs they didn't inherit from nightmares. But in the dark corners of her dreams, she still walked halls that did not exist, touched door handles made of bone, listened to voices speak her name in kindness and warning. Then she wrote them all down. Because stories, even the terrible ones, need endings, or else they bloom again. The attic of the old Renshaw house had long been considered empty. The Renshaws had fled during the second spring of the root wither, after their daughter began singing lullabies in a voice that was not hers and drawing pictures of staircases leading nowhere. The house had been boarded up since then, left to dust and disuse like many buildings touched by the shadow of the house that once stood at the edge of the prairie. Yet, one day in early summer, Ruth Calder walked by the house and felt something. An itch just behind the eyes, a tug in her ribs, a moment of dislocation like stepping into a memory that had never happened. She stopped in front of the porch. The windows were dark. The door chained shut, but the air smelled faintly of dried roses, and above her, from behind the gabled window of the attic, she thought she saw a white cloth move. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. She returned the next day, with the key. Ruth had taken it from the town records before the Renshaws left, unsure why. It fit the lock as though no time had passed. Inside, the house was quiet but not empty. Furniture stood exactly as it had been left. Cups on tables, coats on hooks, a photograph of the Renshaw family half faded on the mantel. Dust clung to everything, yet the path to the attic door was clean, as though someone had walked it recently. Ruth hesitated, fingers brushing the railing, heart pounding in a rhythm she remembered from the days when the house still breathed. She opened the attic door. It smelled like cedar and old dreams. The light filtering through the window revealed stacks of trunks, children's toys, and hanging cloth. And in the center of the room, Suspended from the rafters by a rusted hook hung a wedding dress. It swayed slightly, though there was no wind. It was not one Ruth recognized, and yet it felt achingly familiar. Lace along the sleeves, a train that trailed into shadow, the bodice sewn with tiny symbols that made her mouth dry to look upon. She stepped closer. Her hand shook as she reached out and brushed the fabric. It was cold, damp, and then she heard it. A voice, soft, low, speaking not to her, but to someone else. He said he would bring me lilies, but the roots took them first. Ruth turned, but the attic was empty. The voice continued. Each stitch is a promise, each hymn a burial. I waited so long. Ruth stepped back. The dress swayed again. The voice grew louder. They made a home for me in the rafters of forgotten rooms. They built stories around me like walls. But I was always the doorway. Not him. Not the house. Me. The room darkened. The window blackened, though it was midday outside. Ruth tried to move, but her feet would not obey. The air thickened. Something moved in the corners of the attic, not figures but feelings, shapes of grief, of longing, of promises broken not in words but in memory. The dress began to rise slightly from the hook, not lifted by strings, but by breath. The train coiled along the floor like a serpent waking. And then the voice whispered into her mind directly. Write me down, Ruth. Give me shape. A name was not enough. Ruth gasped. Her hand found her journal, still tucked under her coat. She flipped to a blank page and scrawled the words as quickly as she could. She was not the bride. She was the architect. She built the story from the inside out, and they all stepped into her blueprint. The moment the ink dried, the attic light returned. The air thinned. The dress settled. Ruth fell to her knees, gasping. The voice was gone, but the dress remained. She did not take it down. She did not burn it. Instead, she closed the attic door and locked the house behind her. And she wrote again. That night, the wind carried a different tune. Not the old lullaby, not the calling song of the house, but something newer, something unsure of its own melody. The townsfolk heard it and looked to Ruth, and she nodded. We found the one who built it, she said softly. We've named a root, but the frame, the mind that shaped it, she's still unfolding. They asked her what it meant. She said only, we were looking at the house, but we should have looked at the seamstress. From that day on, people began to tell a different story. One not of Elias Whitmore or the root or the well, but of a woman without a name who sewed rooms together from sorrow, stitched doorways from grief, hemmed stories until they held their shape, and who waited, always waited, for someone to tell her she had been seen. The house did not return, but dreams of staircases leading nowhere increased. Children whispered of attics that hadn't been built yet, and Ruth kept writing, because it was never just about memory. It was about construction, and someone somewhere was still building. In the months that followed Ruth's discovery of the wedding dress, Whitfield changed not with sudden terror or creeping decay, but with a slow unraveling of what the townspeople had once called reality. People began to speak in metaphors they did not understand. Children hummed in unison when passing the Renshaw house, though they had never been taught the melody. Dreams bled into waking hours, sometimes subtly, sometimes so vividly that residents awoke with mud beneath their nails or scraps of cloth stitched into their sleeves. Ruth continued writing, not to silence the changes, but to document them. She no longer fought to forget or to destroy. She had learned the house, the root, the bride, and now the seamstress were not evil in the traditional sense. They were unfinished, misunderstood, trapped within the repetition of a tale no one had ever completed. Ruth's journal had grown into volumes. She wrote of doorways that opened into memories, of hallways that whispered names, of thread that, when followed, led people out of grief but deeper into confusion. Her writing changed the texture of the town. The chapel walls shifted subtly, so that when she stepped inside each morning, she never found herself in the exact same place she'd left the night before. The pews rearranged, the light fell at new angles, and the bell, recast and whole, rang now without ropes. Once every seventh evening, at no discernible time, just once. A note of warning, or of invitation. More than once, Ruth found scraps of cloth outside her home, always pale, always stained faintly with old ink. On one such night, she found a full pattern laid out in pins on her porch floor. It was a blueprint, not for a building, but for a room. A room with no windows, only a door. And sewn along the bottom edge in thread that shimmered faintly in the moonlight were the words, "To enter is to remember, to exit is to remake." She did not know what it meant, but she knew who had sent it. The seamstress. That's what she began calling the force that had taken the shape of the dress in the attic, the architect of the house, the one who laced each tale into the bones of the prairie. Elias Whitmore had been her voice, yes, but not her source. He had been chosen, but the seamstress had built the choosing. And now she was rising again, not in fury, not in vengeance, but in craft. The stories had grown uneven. They had split at the seams, and the seamstress, like any careful artist, was returning to mend what had unraveled. Ruth began noticing other things. Tiny rips along the edge of mirrors, cracks in paint that revealed not what underneath, but words, names, dates, fragments of sentences. Doors in abandoned houses that refused to open, no matter how hard they were forced. And then came the night the town went silent. Not just quiet, silent. No wind, no footsteps, no breathing. The fire in Ruth's hearth crackled without sound. When she stepped outside, the world was motionless. Above, the stars had shifted. They formed a spiral. And in the center of town, in front of the chapel, stood a loom. It had not been there before. No one had seen it arrive. It was large, taller than a man, with spindles of ivory and thread that shimmered faintly between the posts. But it was not weaving. It was waiting. Ruth approached it slowly, her footsteps still soundless, as if even gravity had become hesitant. She reached out and touched the frame. It was warm. Pulse ran through the wood. And then a voice, not from the loom, not from the air, but from behind her own thoughts, spoke. "You stitched me in grief. You hemmed me in forgetting. But now the pattern must complete." Ruth did not reply aloud. She nodded once. The loom began to weave. Thread moved without hands, sliding back and forth in tight, elegant rhythm. And within the growing tapestry, images emerged, not of people or places, but of decisions. A wedding dress never worn. A house never entered. A sermon never spoken. A man who never chose the path beneath the floorboards. A child who never opened the wrong door. Possibilities. Variations. Echoes. Ruth watched and understood the seamstress was not just mending this story. She was gathering every version of it. Every telling. Every forgetting. And she was choosing which ones to keep. The tapestry grew long, dragging along the dirt and curling at the edges like roots. And when it was finished, the loom stilled. The silence broke. The wind returned. The stars reverted. But the loom remained, and the tapestry with it. In the days that followed, Ruth noticed changes in the townsfolk. Eliza Barrow, who had lost 3 sons to fever, woke with dirt under her nails and dreams of them living still, somewhere east, in a version of Whitfield where no one ever fell ill. Young Toby Griggs, who had never spoken a full sentence, recited a poem one morning about a bride with no veil who danced alone in an empty chapel, laughing. The seamstress was not erasing them. She was offering alternate seams, not redemption, revision. And then, one night, Caleb returned. He walked into the chapel while Ruth was writing. His eyes were distant, but clear. He held a scrap of the tapestry in one hand, cut from the edge, frayed and faintly pulsing. He placed it on the altar. Ruth looked at him and whispered, "Where did you go?" He said, "I walked the rooms between endings." She did not ask for more. They sat in silence. Outside, the loom stood. The tapestry hung. And somewhere deep below the grass and stone, a new foundation was being cut, not for a house, but for a frame. The seamstress was not building a home. She was building a body. One that could walk. One that could choose. One that finally could leave. The orchard had been abandoned for years, ever since the seasons began to warp under the house's long shadow. Fruit had withered on the branch before it could ripen, and the ground had turned soft and sour, like the land itself was rejecting nourishment. But now the trees had begun to bloom again, early, confused blossoms that sprouted in twisted clusters, pale pink and bone white, with petals that fell silently and never touched the ground. Ruth Calder walked through the orchard each morning, following the same narrow path between the rows, notebook in hand, as though walking through someone else's dream. Caleb sometimes walked beside her, but mostly, he sat at the edge of the field where the loom still stood, unraveling a single thread from the tapestry with careful, trembling fingers. He claimed the seamstress didn't mind, that she had told him to find the beginning of a new pattern. He never said what that beginning was. One morning, Ruth found something waiting at the end of the orchard path, a mannequin. It stood between two trees, perfectly upright, wearing no clothes, no paint, no detail. Just an empty human form made of pale wood, featureless and smooth, with arms that hung too long and legs slightly bent like it had been walking and froze mid-step. There were no footprints beneath it. No drag marks. It hadn't been carried. It had appeared. She approached slowly, cautiously. When she was 5 steps away, she stopped. The mannequin turned its head toward her. There was no face, no eyes, no mouth, but it looked at her all the same. It didn't move again, didn't speak, didn't breathe. But Ruth felt something shift in her chest, a quiet ache like grief rising from nowhere. She whispered, "Are you her?" The mannequin didn't respond, but a single blossom fell from the tree above it and landed gently on its shoulder. Ruth reached out. Her fingers brushed the wood. Cold, damp, familiar. And then she saw them, thread lines running along the arms, the legs, the sides of the neck. Not cracks, seams. The mannequin had been sewn together, not carved. She stepped back and returned to the chapel, locking the doors behind her. The townsfolk didn't speak of the mannequin. They avoided the orchard without needing to be told. But some of them began finding things near their homes, scraps of fabric shaped like limbs, buttons and pairs with threads still trailing, the faint smell of cedar and rose water lingering in rooms that hadn't been opened in months. Ruth continued writing. She had started a new volume now, thinner, stitched by hand, its cover made of bark. She called it versioning. In it, she recorded not what had happened, but what could have. She wrote of the mannequin before it had form, before it had voice, before it walked. And as she wrote, she began to sense something building not just in the house, but in herself. A story forming around her spine. The thread pulled tight. Caleb stopped coming to the chapel. One morning, Ruth found his bed empty and the tapestry gone. Only a single note remained, scratched into the wall above his desk. She needs more than memory. She needs embodiment. Ruth didn't know whether to feel fear or sorrow. She took the note and folded it into the pages of versioning. That night, she dreamed of Caleb standing in a room with no corners. The seamstress stood beside him, faceless and vast, draping cloth over his shoulders. He was crying, but not in pain. When she woke, the mannequin had moved. It now stood closer to town, at the end of the chapel's path. Still featureless, still silent, but different. A curve in the spine, one hand raised, as if listening. The townsfolk began to gather again, not out of fear, not with torches or prayers, but with quiet curiosity. Some left gifts near its feet, letters, photos, small trinkets. One child placed her doll beside it and returned the next morning to find the doll redressed in a gown made of gray lace. No one had seen who made it. No one touched the mannequin. But it became a fixture. Presence. And then it began to dream. Ruth discovered this when she found her own handwriting in the notebook she hadn't yet used. Fresh entries written in her style, but not by her hand. Descriptions of places that didn't exist. Rooms made of water. A dress stitched from names. A body of thread, walking. She tried to ignore it at first, but the entries grew more detailed, more confident. They began ending with the same phrase, "I'm almost finished." One evening, as the wind turned warm and directionless, Ruth stood before the mannequin and whispered, "Are you waiting for me to finish you?" The air answered, not in voice, but in rhythm. A pressure in her chest, a flutter behind her eyes. She turned and left. That night, Caleb returned again, but not alone. Ruth woke to find him sitting in the chapel pews, gaunt but calm, the tapestry in his hands. It was shorter now, cut, rewoven. The edges frayed into threads that danced lightly in a candlelight, like breathing. He nodded toward the mannequin outside. "She's almost ready," he said softly. "But she needs a name. One that she chooses. One that's given with intent. Ruth asked, "What happens when she has it?" He smiled sadly. "She stops being a story. She becomes a voice." Outside, the trees began to bend, just slightly. The mannequin lifted its head, and from somewhere inside that blank face came the sound of fabric tightening over bone. The morning came with no sunrise. The sky remained dim, as though the sun had risen behind a veil too thick to see through. A soft haze drifted through Whitfield, and the air felt heavier than usual, not oppressive, but full pregnant with a sense of conclusion. Ruth Calder stood at the chapel window and stared out at the mannequin standing at the end of the path. It had not moved in hours, and yet it had changed again. It now wore a dress, not the wedding dress from the attic, nor anything Ruth had ever seen in town, but something new. The cloth shimmered faintly in the dim light, stitched together from dozens of textures and tones, like scraps gathered from the lives of everyone who had ever lived in Whitfield. It had no sleeves. The seams were visible, thick, proud, intentional. It was not hiding its construction. It was wearing it like a story. Caleb stood beside the mannequin, holding the reworked tapestry like a shawl over his shoulders. His eyes were hollow but alert, fixed on Ruth as she approached. The townsfolk gathered again, not in fear, but in reverence. The air smelled faintly of cedar, of salt, of old paper and burnt thread. Ruth walked slowly toward them, her journal versioning clutched tight in her hand. Caleb nodded but did not speak. The mannequin remained motionless, and yet something inside it pulsed. Ruth stood before it and placed her hand over its chest. The wood was warm now. It pulsed gently under her palm, like a second heart. "You are not the house," she said. "You are not the bride. You are not Elias. You are not the voice in the well. You are not the curse. You are the stitch that held the shape. You are the hand that remembered." The mannequin tilted its head slightly. A sound came from inside, not a word, but a breath. Then Ruth opened her journal and began to read. She read the story from the beginning, not as it had happened, but as it could have. A version in which the house had never taken root, but had been offered one. A version where Elias had listened instead of taken. A version where each woman had chosen the veil, the thread, the ring. A version where the seamstress had not been forgotten, but invited. As she read, the wind began to circle. The trees bent in reverent silence. The chapel bell, untouched, let out a single low tone. The mannequin's seams glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with Ruth's words. She finished the final sentence, and she remembered her own name because someone had given it to her freely. The mannequin stepped forward. Just once. Then its face changed, not in structure, but in weight. The blank surface became expressive not through features, but through presence. Its silence felt shaped. It was no longer absence, but choice. Caleb stepped beside Ruth and unfurled the tapestry. She chose, he whispered. She chose her shape. Now she needs a name that belongs to no story but hers. Ruth stepped forward. Her lips trembled. "I name you Seleth," she whispered, "because it means nothing until you make it mean something." The wind stopped. The air stilled. And from deep inside the mannequin, something moved. Not a creature. Not a soul. A decision. The mannequin, Seleth, reached out and touched Ruth's hand. And in that moment, Ruth saw everything. Not visions. Not memories. But blueprints. The first stitch. The last sigh. The folding of rooms that had never existed. The echo of a house that had never been built. The grief that shaped the walls. The longing that carved the windows. And most of all, the patience. The long, aching patience of a being who waited not to be released, but to be understood. Ruth wept, not out of fear, but gratitude. She whispered, "You don't have to hold it anymore." And Seleth stepped back. Her seams unraveled, not into chaos, but into light. Each thread floated into the air like ash from a sacred fire, glowing faintly as it drifted skyward. The mannequin folded inward, slowly, gently, like a story finishing itself. The dress collapsed into petals. The wood softened into soil. The last thing to vanish was the thread at her heart, silver, thin, humming, spooling upward into the clouds. When the light faded, the orchard was still, the grass untouched, the sky clearing. Caleb turned to Ruth, his face damp with tears. "She let go," he said. "She finally let go." The townsfolk slowly returned to their homes. Some cried, some smiled, none spoke. There was nothing to say. The house never returned. The root never pulsed again. The chapel remained, but its walls no longer shifted. Its bell no longer rang on its own. The loom at the edge of town fell apart one night, its pieces found scattered across the field like bones. And Ruth kept writing. Not of horrors, not of echoes, but of choices. She wrote the world as it was, and as it might be, and as it once had nearly been. Caleb left soon after. He followed the wind, carrying a thread she had given him, wrapped around a needle carved from the old chapel door. And somewhere, across a field, or through a dream, or beneath the fold of time, a new story began. One not bound in fear, but sown with intent. Ruth Calder remained in Whitfield after Seletha's passing, not because she was bound by duty or fear, but because she understood that not all endings require departure. Some simply asked for witnesses. The town, now quiet in a way it had never truly known, adjusted to life without the house, without the dreams, without the weight of half-told stories pressing against their ribs. The children stopped singing in unison. The trees bore fruit in their proper season. The well water remained clear. And yet, even in peace, Ruth could feel the ghost of the thread, not haunting but humming faintly beneath her feet. A quiet rhythm, like a heartbeat long since released but whose memory lingered in the bones of the town. She continued writing, not out of compulsion but choice. Her final journal, smaller than the others, was bound in blue cloth and had only one word stitched across the front: closure. The journal was not for the seamstress, or the house, or the root. It was for Ruth. For the versions of herself that had wandered corridors that never existed. For the girl who had once believed silence was safety, who had learned instead that silence only fed the shape in the dark. Each morning, she wrote one sentence. Not a chapter. Not a sermon. Just a sentence, clear, simple, real. And each evening, she would read it aloud at the altar of the chapel, now a place not of faith, but of memory. Some townsfolk joined her. Others didn't. That was fine. The chapel no longer demanded belief, only presence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the field where the house had once stood, a traveler arrived. He wore a coat woven with sigils too old to name and walked with a limp that left no trail. He introduced himself not with a name but with a question. Is there room for another story? Ruth looked him over. His eyes were kind but tired, as if he had seen the same pattern repeated too many times in too many places. She nodded and offered him a chair. He sat and produced a small pouch of thread, laying it on the chapel steps. I came from Hollowton, he said softly, west of the divide. The root hasn't reached it yet, but it remembers something. It's starting to speak in dreams again. Ruth's hand tightened around her journal. It's never finished, is it? She asked. He shook his head. No. But sometimes it pauses. Sometimes it chooses to rest. And sometimes someone gives it a name that holds. He gestured at the field behind her. You held it here. That matters. It changes the shape elsewhere. Ruth turned and looked across the grass. The wildflowers had returned, pale purple and white, curling gently in the wind. No house, no shadow, just space. That night she dreamed again. Not of the house, not of Elias or Clara or the seamstress, but of the thread itself. It floated above her like a river of silver, stretching in both directions beyond what her eyes could follow. On either side of it stood versions of herself, a girl too afraid to speak, a woman buried in her books, a preacher who never stood behind a pulpit, a mother who had never been. They all stared at the same thread, whispering the same question. Where does it begin? Ruth awoke with the answer already forming in her mouth. It doesn't, she said aloud. It's not meant to. The next morning, she did not write her sentence. She closed the blue journal and placed it on the altar beside the visitor's thread pouch. She opened the chapel doors and let the wind carry her silence. And then, for the first time in months, she walked away. Not out of fear, not in flight, but in trust. She left the chapel to the people, to the space, to the story no longer being written by pain. The town would endure. The town would forget. The town would remember. That was its right. She wandered west for a time, guided by instinct more than map. She passed places that felt thin, valleys where sound disappeared, lakes where the water ran backward for a breath or two. She saw houses half-formed in fog, people with mismatched eyes, children counting backward in their games. But she did not stop. She did not stitch herself into their tales. She had given enough thread. Months passed, maybe years. Time bent differently now. The world beyond Whitfield had always held its own stories, some darker, some softer. She eventually found a place where the land hummed not with hunger, but potential. A hill with no name, a tree that bent into the shape of a question mark, a sky that always looked like dawn. And she stayed, built nothing, dug no foundation, simply sat and waited. And one morning, just as the sun rose from behind a ribbon of cloud, a single thread appeared in the grass before her. It shimmered in gold, unlike any she had seen. It was not a thread of fear, nor of grief, nor of repetition. It was warm, new, unknown. She picked it up, and she smiled, because now the story was hers, not to end, but to begin. The hill where Ruth Calder chose to rest was not marked on any map. It existed just beyond the reach of cartographers and memory, somewhere between the last story and the next. Birds flew overhead, though they sang no songs. The wind passed through tall grass with a hush that suggested listening rather than movement. Ruth had not spoken aloud in days, not for lack of need, but because silence felt more appropriate in a place untouched by retelling. She had no chapel here, no altar, no pages to fill, only the thread she had found, golden and warm, tucked carefully inside her pocket like a promise too fragile to speak of yet. She held it sometimes in her palm at sunset, letting it catch the light and burn slightly against her skin, not painfully, but insistently. She was not afraid of it. She had learned the difference between what asks to be heard and what demands to be obeyed. On the 13th morning, as a soft mist crept through the grass and vanished again by midday, a man arrived. He said nothing as he approached, only knelt at the base of the hill and placed something in the soil, a stone small and round, etched with a spiral. He nodded once to Ruth and turned to go. She didn't ask his name. She had no need to. Others followed in the days after. A woman in a red cloak who hummed lullabies Ruth remembered from her childhood but couldn't have known. A child with gray eyes who carried a pouch of dried petals and spoke only in questions. A twin who claimed to have no sibling. They came and they went, never all at once, each one leaving something behind, a feather, a ribbon, a burnt page, a coin bent down the center. No one explained. No one asked for explanation. The hill had become a place that gathered, not in the way the house once had, which devoured grief and multiplied it, but in the way a well gathers reflection. One evening, as the light fractured over the horizon and the first star flickered into being, Ruth took out the golden thread and held it between her fingers. It vibrated slightly, as if aware of the moment. She whispered, "I don't want to shape you into something you're not." The thread pulsed. Not agreement, not denial, just presence. She had learned by now that threads do not speak, but they do answer if you ask the right question. So she asked, "Where do you want to go?" And then she saw it. Not with her eyes, but with memory's bones. A place beneath a tree, not this one, but older. Older than story, older than language. A tree whose branches held bells instead of fruit, and whose trunk bore hundreds of knots, each one shaped like a door. Beneath it sat a loom, not as large as the seamstress's, but smaller, rougher, like a child's version. And beside it sat someone. Not Ruth, not Seleth. Someone new. Someone unborn. They looked up, held out their hands, and whispered a word Ruth had never heard but knew instantly meant home. She opened her eyes. The thread had unraveled in her lap. Not loose, not wasted, but arranged. A single spiral across the grass, pointing not to the past, but forward. A line to walk. A direction not of time, but of intent. Ruth followed it. Each step felt heavier than the last, not with burden, but with weight. The way truth is heavy because it has nowhere left to hide. At the end of the thread stood a tree. Not the one from her vision, not entirely, but its echo. It bent slightly to the left, as if listening. Its roots were exposed, but they held no rot, just history. And at its base sat something unexpected. A book, bound in bark, held closed by a clasp of thread the same color as the one Ruth carried. She knelt before it, opened it, and saw only blank pages. But she understood. This was not a story to be written. It was one to be remembered. And so she began, not with ink, not with pen, but with breath. She spoke the first sentence aloud, not to herself, not to the wind, but to the tree, to the thread, to whatever still listened. To be forgotten is not to vanish. It is only to wait for someone to remember you differently. The air shifted. A warm hush passed over her skin, and the tree dropped a single leaf. It landed on the open page, and stuck, not pressed, not dried, alive, breathing. She closed the book, clasped it shut, and stood. Behind her, the spiral faded. Ahead of her, no path waited, because she no longer needed one. The story had found its center, and the thread, unbroken, rested quietly in her palm. Ruth Calder carried the closed book in her arms for 3 days without opening it again. Not out of fear, but reverence. It no longer felt like hers alone. Each step she took seemed to echo beyond her, as if the very ground remembered the sound of her presence and answered gently with a softened breeze or a rustle in the tall grass. The thread remained coiled in her pocket, its golden length humming ever so faintly when the wind rose. She no longer walked toward anything. She walked as if following a rhythm that had finally settled into her bones, familiar, slow, steady, not forced. She passed no towns, no rivers, no roads, only open country that bent around her path like it knew who she was, or more precisely, what she had carried and what she had helped release. And on the 4th day, something changed. She stopped at a small rise and saw the land curve downward into a basin, shallow but wide, like a bowl carved by forgotten hands. At its center stood a single figure, tall, unmoving, wrapped in a long gray coat that billowed despite the stillness of the air. As Ruth descended, the thread in her pocket pulsed once, like a heartbeat. The figure did not turn to face her, but she knew it had been waiting. When she drew near, she recognized it not as a stranger, but as a reflection. Not her own, not Celithus. Something in between. The shape of an idea unfinished. A form built from untold pages. It had no face, but its hands were covered in ink. Its breath smelled like old stories. "Is it you?" Ruth asked, not knowing who she meant. The figure tilted its head slightly. Not yes, not no, just acknowledgement. She stepped closer and placed the book between them. "I brought the end," she whispered, "but I don't think it wants to be closed." The figure raised a hand and touched the book. The clasp unlatched itself. The cover lifted, and the blank pages began to turn, one by one, faster and faster, until they blurred like wings in flight. And then they stopped, on a page no longer blank. A spiral had been drawn across it, delicate and precise, with hundreds of small marks around the edges. Names, symbols, tiny stitched shapes of houses, dresses, teeth, bells, keys, all layered over one another. The spiral moved. It breathed, and from the center, a second thread began to rise. Not gold, but white, weightless, like a promise waiting to be made. Ruth reached out. The thread did not burn. It did not hum. It settled in her palm and wrapped itself once around her wrist. Then it disappeared, sinking beneath her skin with the gentleness of light filtering into a dream. She staggered back, her breath caught in her throat. And then she felt it. Not pain, not invasion, but understanding. The spiral was not a place. It was not even a story. It was a function. A turning inward that revealed how every telling, every house, every seamstress, every offering, and every silence was part of a pattern designed to fold and unfold forever unless someone stepped outside of it, not with defiance, but with acceptance. The stories did not need to end. They needed to evolve. She looked up, and the figure was gone. In its place stood a pool of water, perfectly still, round like an eye, reflecting only the sky. Ruth stepped to the edge and saw herself, not as she was, but as she had been, as a child in Whitfield, as a girl standing before a silent pulpit, as a woman standing before a house that wanted her memory more than her flesh, as someone who chose not to run. And then for the first time she saw the woman she had never dared imagine. Ruth, older, gentler, seated beneath a tree, children gathered at her feet, no books in her lap, just thread, teaching them to sow not fear but choice. She smiled, and the image dissolved. She returned to the book and lifted it again. The spiral had stopped moving. The marks had quieted. The clasp relocked without her help. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the basin was full of figures, silent, still, not hostile, waiting. They were the unfinished, the half-told, the nearly named. They had no mouths, no eyes, but they held thread in their hands, thousands of threads, all reaching toward her, not as plea, not as demand, but as invitation. She raised her hand, and every thread lowered in reply. She whispered, "You're not forgotten." The air shifted. A low harmonic sound rippled across the land. It was not music. It was not speech. It was potential gathering itself. And Ruth knew what she had to do. She tore a single page from the book. She pressed her finger to the center. She whispered her name, not the one given to her by her mother, nor the one the seamstress once whispered in her dreams, but the one she had written quietly 100 times in the margins of stories that never made it past the first draft. She whispered, "I am the spiral. I am the thread. I am the version that does not forget." And the page lit gently. No flame, no smoke, just warmth. And when it cooled, it had become a new clasp, thread-stitched, shaped like an open eye. She placed it back onto the book, and the book pulsed once, then rested. She turned to the silent figures, and for the first time they moved, not toward her, but forward, each walking a different direction, thread trailing behind them like tails of stars, leaving the spiral, becoming stories of their own. And Ruth, now the keeper of no house, no root, no altar, no loom, walked the other way, not toward memory, but toward voice. And she began to hum a new tune, not a lullaby, not a warning, just a song, simple, incomplete, waiting for someone else to add the next verse. Somewhere beyond where maps end and language phrase, Ruth found herself walking through a field that had no edges. The grass was pale and soft beneath her boots, and the sky above looked more like fabric than air, thick with clouds stitched in looping rows that shimmered in the light of a sun that didn't burn. The book she carried, now clasped shut with the eye-shaped thread lock, no longer felt like a burden. It had become something else entirely, a compass without direction, a vessel of resonance, an archive not of events, but of choices. She had not opened it since leaving the basin. There was no need. It pulsed quietly in her arms, a heartbeat beside her own. Ruth knew now she wasn't carrying the past. She was carrying memory itself, woven, unfinished, listening. In the far distance, a structure began to emerge. At first, she thought it was another tree, wide and tall and rooted in some dream of permanence. But as she approached, she saw that it wasn't a tree at all, nor a tower, nor a house. It had no roof, no doors, just hundreds of frames, wooden, iron, bone, glass, stacked atop one another, rising like a skeleton of a building long forgotten. Between the frames, no walls, just thread. Thousands of lines stretched from post to post, forming webbed corridors of shifting light. Some threads glowed faintly, others were dark as ash. Some were frayed, others pulled tight and still. They pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, and Ruth knew instantly that they were stories. Not told, not written, just remembered. This was the archive, not a place built by hands, but one formed in the afterthought of every story that had ever been forgotten too soon. It stood outside time, a monument not to endings, but to the pauses between them. Ruth stepped inside. The grass under her feet didn't flatten. The wind did not change. She was not announced, not welcomed, but she belonged. She walked between the frames, her fingers brushing threads that hummed beneath her touch. Each contact sparked a flicker in her mind, a whisper, a face, a moment. A child choosing not to open a door. A woman bearing a name beneath her tongue. A man planting a seed that would never bloom. None of them her. All of them part of her now. The archive was not quiet, though no voices filled it. The sound was deeper, like water moving underground, like fire burning behind glass. Each step Ruth took echoed not backward, but outward. She reached a frame taller than the others, wrapped in threads of black and red. As her fingers touched the wood, a knot in the center unraveled, revealing a figure standing across from her. A girl young, perhaps 10, her eyes stitched shut, her hands covered in ink. She held a pair of scissors made of bone. She did not speak. Ruth knelt and whispered, "Are you here to cut me away?" The girl shook her head. Instead, she stepped forward, lifted the scissors, and carefully cut a single thread from Ruth's wrist, the last length of the golden thread that had burrowed beneath her skin. Ruth did not flinch. The cut did not hurt. It released something, not from the body, but from the story that had followed her. The girl took the thread, tied it around her own wrist, and turned to leave. Ruth stood in silence and watched her walk deeper into the frames. The black and red threads surrounding the tall frame began to shift, transforming into lines of pale green and violet. Soft new. The past was not erased. It was changed. Ruth moved deeper into the archive. She found corridors where stories were still forming, threads that twisted but had no anchor, no name. She found places where threads had snapped mid-stitch, their ends curled like dying vines. She found one frame entirely blank, no thread at all, just a shallow dish of water beneath it. She peered into the water and saw her own face, not as she was now, but as she had been long before Whitfield, before the chapel, before the house. A girl standing alone in a storm, holding a thread she had never dared tie into anything. She touched the surface of the water and saw a change, a ripple, a spiral. A single name, Seleth, appeared and faded. The girl in the reflection smiled, and Ruth smiled with her. At the center of the archive stood a pedestal. Upon it, a needle, simple, silver, thin enough to pass through memory itself. Ruth approached, placed the book beside it, and rested her hands on the pedestal. She did not speak. She did not need to. The needle rose, hovered, and pointed toward her chest. Slowly, carefully, it pressed forward and stitched a new thread into her collarbone, a line of white so fine it could only be seen in moonlight. It was not a burden. It was not a bond. It was a vow. To remember. To record. To retell. Not the story she had lived, but the stories yet to find her. When the thread was tied, the needle lowered itself into the pedestal and vanished. Ruth took the book, turned, and walked out of the archive without walls. The frames did not collapse behind her. They remained, waiting, listening. She returned to the field. The sky above her rippled once, like fabric in the breeze, and then the horizon shifted, not closer, not further, but wider. She had not ended the spiral. She had walked it until it became a line, and now she would carry it forward. Not for the past, but for what came next. The wind carried a stillness now. Not silence, but a hush that followed Ruth like a shadow that no longer hid. She had crossed the archive without walls, left the spiral behind, let the seamstress become a name remembered instead of a presence endured. Yet, even as her steps led her into new landscapes, plains untouched by memory, rivers that did not reflect, forests that grew in the shape of unanswered questions, she felt something within her begin to stir again. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sorrow. It was the echo of movement, of unfinished melody. The thread stitched into her collarbone remained warm. It pulsed not like a warning, but like a drumbeat, low and even, guiding, never forcing. She thought perhaps this would be the rest of her life, walking the world, feeling echoes rise and fall, remembering stories before they had a chance to be forgotten. She had become, in her own way, a vessel, a historian of versions, a quiet weaver of closures. But then she saw the bird. It was perched alone on a crumbling fence post, black feathers tipped in gray, its head cocked toward her with an intelligence too sharp to be natural. It didn't move as she passed. It didn't blink. But when she turned her head, it was gone. And where it had sat, a single thread remained, caught on the splintered wood, red, frayed, blood-bright. Not the color of violence, the color of memory. It pulsed once when she touched it. Then she knew. Whitfield was remembering again. Not the horror, not the house, but the space that had been left behind in its absence. The hill, the chapel, the seed of the story still rooted in the land, quiet and dreaming. She turned around, not with dread, with decision. She walked for 5 days beneath a sky that dimmed earlier than it should, the air growing heavier with each passing hour. Not malevolent, just expectant. On the 6th day, the wind stopped entirely. On the 7th, she crossed the threshold of the town. Whitfield was smaller now. Houses leaned inward, as if listening. The roads had narrowed. The chapel stood, but the bell was gone. In its place, a thread hung from the steeple, tied into a loose knot that swayed in air that didn't move. Children no longer played, but they watched her. Quietly. From windows, from porches, from behind curtains. Their eyes held no fear, just recognition. They remembered her. And she remembered the promise. She walked to the field where the house had once stood. It was not empty. At the center of the grass was a spiral made of stones, small, pale, arranged with care. In the center stood a mannequin. But it was not Seleth. This one was shorter, unfinished, wrapped in linen from the waist down, its upper frame exposed and splintered, as though someone had begun to build and stopped halfway through. In its chest was a hollow space the shape of a book. Ruth stepped forward. She placed the final journal, the one bound in blue, into the mannequin's chest. The moment it settled into place, the thread in her collarbone pulled taut. Not painfully, but completely. It was time. The mannequin inhaled. No sound, no motion. Just breath that moved across the land, ruffling leaves that hadn't moved in weeks. The spiral of stones trembled. The children came forward now, one by one, standing around the edge. No adults, only those who had not yet learned to forget. Ruth stood back. The mannequin began to speak, not aloud, not with voice, but with presence. Each child's face changed. They were not afraid. They were listening. And after a moment, one stepped forward. A girl no older than 8. She reached out and placed her hand against the mannequin's arm. A thread passed between them. Blue, then green, then gold. The mannequin's seams began to close. Not with thread, with choice. Each child stepped forward. Each gave something, tears, a button, a laugh, and name. And with each offering, the mannequin became more itself. By the time the last child stepped away, it was complete. No longer featureless. No longer blank. It looked like no one they had known, but like everyone they had trusted. And then it turned to Ruth, stepped forward, and embraced her. The thread in her chest loosened, lifted, unwound, and drifted upward into the sky like smoke. She collapsed, not from pain, but from release. When she opened her eyes, the mannequin was gone. The children were laughing. The grass was singing, and in the center of the spiral was only the book, open, its pages fluttering, its ink writing itself in real time. New stories, born not of grief, but of beginning. She smiled, let her eyes close again, and somewhere deep within the land, the last thread tied itself into a knot. Not to bind, to mark the end of a story, and the start of a world. Long after the thread had vanished into the sky and the field had grown soft with clover, long after the children of Whitfield forgot the names that once curled beneath their beds, a door appeared in the chapel that no one remembered building. It was small, only waist-high, tucked behind the pulpit where Ruth used to stand and read aloud the sentences she wrote for no audience but the walls. The door had no knob, only a single phrase etched in brass for those who still wonder. No one noticed it at first. It didn't call. It didn't glow. It simply waited. Until one morning, a child named Jonah, born 2 seasons after the final spiral faded, knelt near the pulpit to retrieve a dropped pencil and felt a breeze from nowhere. When he looked up, the door was open. Not wide, but enough. Enough to let in the scent of thread and wood and dried ink. He called out, but no one heard. And so he crawled inside. The room was too large for its dimensions. It stretched in impossible ways, bending not into corridors, but into ideas. The walls were shelves, but there were no books. Instead, there were objects: a broken comb, a braid of silver hair, a ring carved from ash wood, a cracked photograph of a house that had never existed. And above each item, the thread hung from the ceiling, no longer taut, no longer pulsing. Just still, like the breath held after a song ends. Jonah stood quietly. He felt no fear, only knowing. At the center of the room was a chair. In it sat a figure wrapped in cloth. The cloth shifted in time with Jonah's breath, as if the figure were matching his rhythm. Its head was bowed. Its hands rested on its lap. In them, a single spool of golden thread. The figure raised its head. It was not Ruth. It was not the seamstress. It was someone else, new, but somehow familiar. She spoke without sound. "Will you carry one thread?" Jonah nodded. He reached out, took the spool, and as his fingers touched it, he saw, just briefly, every version of Whitfield, of the house, of the root, of the ones who remembered and the ones who chose to forget. He saw Ruth standing under the tree, that bent like a question. He saw Caleb walking through a forest of dreams, leaving thread in his footsteps. He saw a door opening in a town far away. And then he blinked. The figure was gone. The room was empty, and in his hand, the thread had vanished, but he could feel it beneath his skin, humming faintly. He crawled back out of the door. It closed behind him. No one else ever found it again. But sometimes, when Jonah told stories around the fire, quiet ones, about names no one taught him and houses that never stood, people listened harder than usual. Because even though the tale was strange and quiet and unfinished, they could swear they'd heard it before. Somewhere, in a whisper, in a dream, in a room that remembered.